The devastating assault on December 7, 1941, thrust the United States Pacific Fleet into an unprecedented situation where carrier aviation became the principal striking force of a damaged and seemingly outmatched naval organization. Pre-war strategic concepts for warfare with Japan, which had anticipated a Pacific offensive spearheaded by battleships, required complete restructuring after the Pearl Harbor bombardment. The carrier admirals would receive their opportunity to demonstrate the value of seaborne air power, though they confronted conditions where victory was far from guaranteed and defeat might leave America's entire western coastline vulnerable to attack. The prospect was daunting, yet Pacific Fleet personnel in early 1942 would prove their abilities surpassed all expectations. Throughout the opening phase, preceding the Coral Sea and Midway battles, carrier warfare constituted an unproven fighting technique from the American viewpoint. Aircraft carriers existed in desperately limited numbers. At the moment of the Pearl Harbor strike, the United States Navy possessed 7 fleet carriers and 1 escort carrier, operating a total of 441 combat aircraft. Within the Pacific region, the fleet deployed merely 3 carriers, Enterprise and Lexington, both operating from Pearl Harbor while executing separate missions to transport vital aircraft to island installations on December 7th, plus Saratoga stationed at San Diego when the Japanese launched their assault. Measured against subsequent wartime standards, the Pacific Fleet's aviation component appeared relatively modest, yet represented the sole available instrument for counterattacking Japanese positions. The central challenge involved determining the optimal methods, timing, and locations for employing United States carrier forces against Japan's imperial strongholds and formidable fleet. On December 10th, Admiral Husband Kimmel's staff, through a fresh evaluation of Pacific conditions, emphasized that the remaining United States striking elements of carriers, cruisers, and destroyers must function with aggressive boldness on the tactical offensive to overcome their initial catastrophe. Among the 3 carrier groups immediately prepared for Pacific action, 2 would continue at sea while the 3rd replenished at Pearl Harbor through rotational scheduling. The initial objective involved attempting to assist the besieged garrison on remote Wake Island. The Wake relief mission focused on carrier Saratoga, departing from the west coast as Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch's flagship carrying Marine Fighter Squadron VMF 221, which embarked 18 Brewster Buffalo fighters, designed to strengthen VMF 211, already experiencing severe casualties on Wake. Admiral Kimmel designated Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, senior to Fitch, as overall Task Force 14 commander. Additionally, Task Force 11, commanded by Vice Admiral Wilson Brown and built around Lexington, received orders to raid Jaluit in the Marshall Islands as a diversion supporting the Wake operation. Delays plagued the Wake relief effort extensively. Task Force 11 departed Pearl Harbor on December 14th bound for the Marshalls, but later received orders to turn northward and assist Fletcher's Task Force 14 in the Wake operation. On December 16th, 3 Lexington scout planes reported sighting and attacking a Japanese carrier of the Ryujo class 95 miles south of the task force. Admiral Brown launched an attack group consisting of 29 bombers and 7 fighters against the target, but the supposed carrier proved to be merely a drifting United States Navy dynamite barge. Task Force 14 left Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 16th, but subsequent progress remained sluggish due to the painfully slow speed of fleet oiler Netches. The Japanese proceeded to attack Wake Island in force and captured the island on the 23rd, while the United States task forces remained too distant to provide any support for the Marines, and never engaged any element of the Japanese invasion or covering forces. Fleet intelligence estimated that at least 2 Japanese carriers, plus battleships and heavy cruisers, operated in Wake's vicinity at this time. Vice Admiral William Pye, then serving as acting Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, decided against risking his carriers and recalled Fletcher and Brown to Pearl Harbor. On December 31, 1941, Admiral Chester Nimitz took formal command of the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, while Admiral Ernest King became the new Commander-in-Chief, United States Fleet, in Washington. King instructed Nimitz to hold the Hawaiian Island chain while maintaining the communication line between the West Coast and Australia through establishment of a base chain along the route from Hawaii to Fiji. A new Task Force 17, organized around carrier Yorktown, which had passed through the Panama Canal in late December en route to San Diego, was designated to cover delivery of marine reinforcements to Samoa. Admiral Fletcher flew to San Diego to assume command of Task Force 17, which departed on January 6 bound for the South Pacific. Yorktown's arrival in the Pacific at this time proved fortunate, because on January 11th, Saratoga was torpedoed by Japanese submarine I-6 near Johnston Island and had to return to the west coast for repairs. Saratoga remained out of action for months, and until April, Nimitz would operate with only 3 fleet carriers. The key question at this war stage concerned the direction of the next Japanese advance. The expanding Japanese presence in the Marshalls and Gilberts indicated that the next major Japanese move might target Samoa or Fiji. As insurance against such an eventuality, Halsey's Task Force 8 and Fletcher's Task Force 17 were earmarked for early raids against the Marshalls and Gilberts. Halsey received direction to hit Vautier and Maloelap, 2 seaplane bases in the eastern Marshalls, and elected also to attack Japanese shipping and aircraft at Kwajalein Atoll. Fletcher received the mission of raiding Makin in the northern Gilberts and Jaluit and Mili in the southern Marshalls. Approaching their respective targets from Samoa's direction, the 2 task forces parted company on January 31st evening and launched their strikes before sunrise on February 1st, 1942. Halsey brought Enterprise within 40 miles of Vautier before launching his attacks. The initial assault, commanded by Commander Howard Young, Enterprise Air Group leader, proceeded toward Kwajalein Atoll with 37 dive bombers and 9 torpedo bombers. The main targets included the airfield at Roy on the lagoon's northern extremity, Kwajalein Island on the southern terminus, and any vessels positioned between them. During the inbound approach, the formation experienced difficulty identifying targets on Roy through early morning haze, and surprise was compromised. Japanese defenders responded with intensive anti-aircraft fire and succeeded in launching numerous fighters into combat. 4 Dauntless dive bombers were destroyed during the airfield assault. However, the remainder of Young's formation, proceeding toward Kwajalein, accomplished remarkable success. Supported by a subsequent strike from 9 Devastator torpedo bombers of Torpedo 6, the Kwajalein Assault Group received credit for destroying 2 vessels and inflicting damage on at least 7 additional ships. 18 enemy aircraft were eliminated or severely damaged, while the regional commander, Rear Admiral Yashiro, perished in the action. Taroa Airfield on Maloelap Atoll was attacked by Wildcat fighters, and later by dive bombers which had returned from the Kwajalein Raid and were relaunched. On the Taroa strike, Lieutenant Junior Grade Wilmer Rawi became the first United States Navy fighter pilot in World War II to down an enemy plane when he destroyed a fighter. Vautier was attacked initially by Wildcats carrying 100-pound bombs and gunfire from Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance's cruisers and destroyers. Near midday, Young led another force of 8 dive bombers and 9 bomb-armed torpedo bombers against Vautier, causing substantial damage on the island. To the south, Fletcher's Task Force 17 encountered greater difficulties due to bad weather, especially over Jaluit. Commander Curtis Smiley, Yorktown's Air Group commander, led 17 dive bombers and 11 torpedo bombers against Jaluit, but succeeded only in damaging 2 ships in the harbour while losing 6 aircraft. The attacks on Makin and Mili achieved even less than the Jaluit raid. 1 Japanese 4-engine flying boat attacked the task force, but was shot down by Yorktown's Combat Air Patrol. Fletcher decided that the results obtainable, given the weather conditions and the already heavy losses suffered, did not warrant another attack on these targets, and he ordered a retirement after recovery of the initial strikes. These raids exposed weaknesses in the American effort. The mix of aircraft in the carrier air groups was inadequate, because more than a single squadron of fighters was needed. Fighters were required for combat air patrol and bomber escort duty, as well as for supplemental attacks on land targets and shipping. This problem of a shortage of fighters and badly needed reserve pilots in the carrier squadrons was gradually rectified. By the conflict's conclusion, fighter-type aircraft, including those functioning as fighter bombers, comprised over 70% of a fleet carrier's aircraft complement, contrasting sharply with only 25% fighters in early 1942. Machine guns on the Wildcat fighters also experienced frequent jamming, caused by ammunition belt displacement within their containers, which occurred during intense combat maneuvering. This difficulty was rapidly addressed. Nevertheless, other concerns, including insufficient incendiary ammunition and unreliable aerial torpedoes, which frequently ran too deeply or failed to detonate upon impact, required extended periods to remedy. While the Enterprise and Yorktown groups conducted Central Pacific operations, Admiral Brown's Lexington force provided protection for two essential convoys that transited the Panama Canal in late January, carrying desperately needed personnel and equipment for island installations extending from Bora Bora to New Caledonia. By January's end, the Japanese threat to Noumea and Port Moresby was becoming increasingly real, with the possibility existing that the Japanese might invade New Caledonia even before American garrison troops could reach that destination. Using Rabaul as a base, the enemy could strike out in numerous directions, and there were few Allied forces located at that time between Rabaul and the northeast coast of Australia. Admiral Brown, directed by Admiral King to operate west of Fiji in conjunction with other Allied naval and air forces, determined that the time was appropriate for a carrier strike against Rabaul itself. But certain problems were evident in any attempt to hit Rabaul. The distance from the fleet support base at Pearl Harbor was huge, some 3,000 miles, and the availability of fuel could present a serious issue, especially given the vulnerability of the slow-moving fleet oilers to submarine attack. Repairs could not be readily effected in the South Pacific. The charts of the waters around New Guinea, New Britain, New Ireland, and the Solomons were woefully out of date, and the Japanese 24th Air Flotilla, operating out of Rabaul, was known to conduct regular air searches to the eastward, with coverage of up to 600 miles from base. Brown hoped to elude such searches and sneak within 125 miles of Rabaul before launching his strike. Unfortunately, at shortly after 10 o'clock on February 20th, while Task Force 11 was still 450 miles east of Rabaul, Lexington's radar detected an enemy float plane 43 miles from the task force. Although Lexington's combat air patrol succeeded in downing the intruder and a second Japanese scout plane, at least one other flying boat escaped the Wildcats. Brown had to assume that his presence had been discovered and reported, as was in fact the case. But he decided to continue on toward Rabaul in an attempt to bluff the Japanese into thinking that he was proceeding with the planned attack. The Japanese responded to Brown's incursion by launching a two-wave attack against the task force, involving a total of 17 twin-engine bombers. At 16:11, the first wave of 9 bombers was picked up on Lexington's radar, and the carrier's fighter director vectored the 6 Wildcats flying combat air patrol at that time to intercept the raiders, as the deck crew scrambled to get additional Wildcats aloft. The Wildcat pilots succeeded in shooting down all 9 in the first wave, and though several of the raiders were able to drop their bombs, the attacks were wildly inaccurate and caused no damage to the task force. At 17:05, 8 more bombers bore down on Brown's ships, but these too were effectively fought off, with Lieutenant Butch O'Hare single-handedly destroying 3 bombers and seriously damaging 2 more. One of the crippled bombers attempted to crash Lexington, but splashed 1,500 yards off the carrier's port bow. By 17:45, the battle was over. The Japanese air attack had been a total failure, with 15 bombers and 2 flying boats destroyed. Lexington's Fighting 3, under Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch, suffered 2 downed Wildcats, including 1 pilot killed and another wounded. All told, it was a startlingly one-sided victory for Lexington's fighter squadron and a defeat with strategic implications for the Japanese. The 24th Air Flotilla's medium bomber force had been gutted and would have to be replaced with additional planes to be flown in from the Marshalls and Marianas. The planned Japanese landings at Lae and Salamaua on the north coast of New Guinea were delayed for 5 days as a result of the new need for redeployment of air assets to the Southwest Pacific. Butch O'Hare was officially credited with downing 5 enemy planes in the February 20th action and was later awarded the Medal of Honor for the feat, thereby becoming the first popular hero of the naval air war in the Pacific, somewhat to his embarrassment. As Admiral Brown's Lexington Group retired southeastward from the vicinity of Rabaul, Admiral Halsey's Task Force 8, which had departed Pearl Harbor on February 14th, neared Wake Island, the objective of the next Central Pacific raid, scheduled for February 24th. Enterprise sent 36 bombers and 6 fighters against the island, effecting only limited destruction, including the sinking of a single Japanese patrol boat and several flying boats. Following the Wake raid, Halsey retired northeastward to refuel and then proceeded westward to raid Marcus Island, another isolated Japanese outpost. No enemy aircraft were engaged over Marcus, and none were sighted on the ground. One dive bomber, however, was lost to anti-aircraft fire. After the raid on Marcus, the Enterprise force swung back toward Pearl Harbor, arriving there on March 10th. The idea of attacking Rabaul was not abandoned after Task Force 11's first unsuccessful attempt to raid that target in February. Admiral Brown, however, believed that another attempt would require more than a single carrier to fend off the strong air opposition anticipated. On February 27th, Nimitz's staff concluded that 2 carriers could operate against Rabaul with a reasonable expectation of success, and that Lexington and Yorktown should be assigned for the job. Brown and Fletcher arranged to rendezvous on March 6th, about 300 miles north of New Caledonia, at which time the 2 task force commanders agreed to make combined air and cruiser bombardment raids against Rabaul and Gasmata on New Britain. The Japanese, however, landed on March 8th at Lae and Salamaua on the north coast of New Guinea, and that event caused a change of target for the American task forces. In order to reduce the chances that their carriers would be discovered on the way to attack the vulnerable shipping lying off Lae and Salamaua, Brown and Fletcher decided to approach the targets from the south rather than from the east. Task Forces 11 and 17 traversed the Coral Sea, and the combined attack was launched at 8 o'clock on March 10th. The day before the raid, Brown had sent 2 officers on missions to gather information on flying conditions over the towering Owen Stanley Mountains, which form the spine of New Guinea's Papuan Peninsula. It was determined that the planes could clear the mountains through a 7,500-foot-high mountain pass that was generally free of mist between 7 o'clock and 11 o'clock. But there was serious question as to whether the short-range Wildcats and heavily laden torpedo bombers could successfully accomplish the mission. During the event, the carriers closed to within 45 miles of the Papuan shoreline before launching, and the single torpedo squadron from Lexington carrying torpedoes on this raid was able to take advantage of a fortuitous updraft to clear the mountains. In all, 18 fighters, 61 dive bombers, and 25 torpedo bombers participated in the raid on the village of Lae and Salamaua Harbor. The attack was well coordinated in multiple waves. The airstrip at Lae was serviceable, but few enemy planes were in evidence at the time. However, 16 ships were present in the Lae-Salamaua area on the date of the raid, and the combination of surprise and lack of fighter cover proved highly damaging to Japanese forces ashore and afloat. At the cost of 1 dive bomber downed by anti-aircraft fire, the raiders sank 3 transports and damaged 6 other ships, including a light cruiser and 2 destroyers, and caused nearly 400 Japanese casualties. By noon of March 10th, the Lexington and Yorktown task forces were withdrawing southeastward at high speed. Neither force saw action again until Fletcher's raid on Tulagi in early May, which was a prelude to the Coral Sea encounter. In January 1942, Captain Francis Lowe, Admiral King's operations officer, had conceived the idea of flying medium bombers off the deck of an aircraft carrier as a means for raiding Tokyo. Admiral King found the idea interesting and directed his air operations officer, Captain Donald Duncan, to work out the details in coordination with the Army Air Force. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle was selected to lead the raid under Admiral Halsey's operational command. A conventional carrier-borne attack had been ruled out due to the fact that the Japanese were capable of operating shore-based aircraft well beyond carrier strike range, and that a line of early warning picket boats was known to be patrolling the waters at least 500 miles off the Japanese home islands. The bombers could carry a 2,000-pound bomb load and could be launched at 500 miles from Tokyo. After dropping their bombs, the aircraft would continue on to land at airfields in China. The Army pilots received training at Eglin Field, Florida, in the unfamiliar art of carrier takeoffs, though they never had the opportunity to perform such takeoffs from a real carrier until they struggled into the air off Hornet's flight deck on the fateful morning of April 18, 1942. Hornet herself was a newly commissioned carrier under the command of naval aviation pioneer Captain Mark Mitcher. She sailed from the East Coast to Alameda, California, where, on April 1st, the 16 bombers of Doolittle's squadron were hoisted aboard. The next day, the Hornet task force, including 2 cruisers, 4 destroyers and an oiler, set out for a mid-ocean rendezvous with Halsey and his Enterprise force. Halsey departed Pearl Harbor on April 8th, meeting Mitch's group on April 13th, well to the north of Midway. The combined force was officially designated Task Force 16 and marked the first instance in the Pacific War where 2 United States Navy carriers operated as part of a single task force, as opposed to the Le Salamaua operation, where 2 task forces operated together for a while and later proceeded independently. The presence of Enterprise as an integral part of the mission was necessitated by the fact that Hornet was incapable of providing her own defensive fighter cover prior to launching the Army bombers. Due to the size of the Army bombers, they could not be stored on the hangar deck and were retained on the flight deck until launching. Hornet's own planes were kept on the hangar deck until the flight deck was cleared of all bombers. Therefore, the Enterprise Air Group was responsible for flying combat air patrol for the entire task force until such time as Hornet could assist in those duties. The lead bomber had only 476 feet of deck to launch from, adequate, as events proved, but hardly reassuring. The original plan was for a night attack against Tokyo and 3 secondary targets, with the carrier launches to take place on the afternoon of the 18th. As Task Force 16 approached within 1,000 miles of Tokyo, the weather turned sour. Just past 3 o'clock on the morning of April 18th, while the task force was still more than 700 miles from Japan, radar contact was made with Japanese picket boats. Halsey deftly changed course to avoid them. 3 hours later, Enterprise planes encountered another picket boat some 42 miles ahead of the force. At 7:44, a third picket boat contact was made, and Halsey had to assume that Tokyo was now aware of Task Force 16's presence. Halsey was at that time over 650 miles east of Tokyo, but could not risk closing further on the target due to loss of the element of surprise. He decided with Doolittle's agreement to launch the bombers as soon as possible, despite the fact that Doolittle's raiders would probably not have enough fuel to reach any friendly airfields in China. The launching operation took place in heavy seas beginning at 8:25 and lasted 59 minutes. Mitch, for one, was not impressed with the facility of the Army pilots in getting their planes into the air. In his after-action report, he noted that with only one exception, takeoffs were dangerous and improperly executed. Apparently, full back stabilizer was used by the first few pilots. As each plane neared the bow, with more than required speed, the pilot would pull up and climb in a dangerous near stall, struggle wildly to nose down, then fight the controls for several miles trying to gain real flying speed and more than 100 feet altitude. Nevertheless, all 16 bombers were successfully launched and proceeded to their targets. The 13 raiders bound for Tokyo appeared over the city near midday, surprising the Japanese High Command, which had figured that no raid could be launched from the sighted carriers until that force had approached much closer to the Japanese coast. All of the planes succeeded in dropping their bombs on the city and continued onward, despite sometimes substantial anti-aircraft fire and the presence of Japanese fighters. The 3 bombers hitting secondary targets also completed their bomb runs and headed for China. None of the planes were able to reach Chinese airfields, however, and with the exception of one bomber that flew to Siberia and was impounded by the Soviets, all of the planes either crashed for want of fuel or crash-landed in China. All told, 71 out of the 80 pilots and crewmen participating in the mission survived it. Of the 9 who did not, 3 were executed by the Japanese after capture in Japanese-occupied areas of China, and a 4th later died in captivity. The damage caused to the targets was not severe, but the psychological effect on both the American and Japanese public perception of the war was enormous. After the Doolittle Raiders were launched, Halsey immediately commenced an eastward retirement. The Japanese attempted a pursuit with aircraft and surface ships, but were unsuccessful at overtaking Task Force 16, which re-entered Pearl Harbor on April 25th after a job well done, despite the loss of all of Doolittle's planes. The American public persisted in viewing the attack as simply Doolittle's raid. Halsey, however, should be accorded his fair share of the glory, given his bold decision to continue with the raid under less than ideal circumstances rather than retire without launching, which was his only other alternative after Surprise had been lost. The Doolittle Raid was the last of the early carrier raids conducted in the Pacific during the 5-month period between Pearl Harbor and the May operations in the Coral Sea. The net effect of these raids was to force the Imperial Japanese Navy to deal with the Pacific Fleet on terms that were not particularly favorable to the Japanese. American commanders attempted to take advantage of the element of surprise and the dispersion of the Japanese fleet as counterweights to the heavy Japanese numerical advantage in ships and aircraft that existed in early 1942. The Tokyo raid settled an argument within the Japanese High Command as to whether an attempt should be made to strike the Pacific Fleet a final, crippling blow or to pursue other, more indirect options. Admiral Yamamoto, an advocate of seeking to destroy the remainder of the Pacific Fleet's striking power, won that argument, and the Battle of Midway followed as a direct consequence. The Battle of Coral Sea has a claim for an eminent place in the history of naval aviation. The closing stages of the action witnessed the first combat between two fleets solely by carrier plane. Furthermore, the battle was the first time, following the outbreak of war on December 7, 1941, that the Japanese advance in the Pacific was halted. Finally, the clash provided the United States Navy, in particular its naval aviation, with its initial victory against the Imperial Japanese Navy. The potential for action arose from Japanese plans in spring 1942 to advance south and southeastward from the Bismarcks and Solomons in the South Pacific. The immediate objectives of the offensive were the capture of Tulagi in the Solomons and Port Moresby, New Guinea, with a second phase plan for the capture of the Nauru and Ocean Islands. Tulagi would be developed as a seaplane base to cover the flank of the advance on Port Moresby and to support later seizures of islands astride the American-Australian supply lines, such as New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. Port Moresby was the most important prize. Its possession would secure Japanese bases on New Guinea and at Rabaul, New Britain, would provide the Japanese with the ability to neutralize North Australian airfields, and would anchor the western flank of the next offensive in the South Pacific. Nauru and Ocean, which contained rich phosphorus deposits essential for Japanese agriculture, were important economically. Following standard Japanese practice, the fleet units assigned to the operation were divided into several groups. 2 units, the Port Moresby and Tulagi invasion groups, carried the ground forces. Support and covering forces protected the Port Moresby group, which consisted of a light carrier, cruisers, and destroyers. The striking force, the most powerful element, consisted of just 2 aircraft carriers. The Japanese, believing that the Allies would offer little resistance and busy re-equipping the remainder of Admiral Nagumo's carriers for attack against Midway, thought that such a small carrier group was sufficient. Given the string of Japanese victories since Pearl Harbor, there was no reason to suspect the offensive would fail. However, far behind the battlefront, the Americans had already scored a devastating victory that provided the possibility of thwarting Japanese intentions. Several months after the war's start, Navy cryptologists, primarily at Station Hypo, Pearl Harbor, broke the Japanese naval code. By analyzing traffic patterns and decoding 10 to 15% of the messages received, Station Hypo gave Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz an accurate picture of Japanese designs. By mid-April, he knew of the enemy's plans to attack Port Moresby. Nimitz had learned that 2 enemy carriers were on the way to Rabaul, and he had sound information on the Port Moresby operation. Consequently, he dispatched carrier Lexington to join carrier Yorktown in the Coral Sea. The action was divided into 2 distinct phases, the actions on May 1st through 7th, and the carrier battle on the 8th. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's task force of Lexington, Yorktown, and 2 cruiser divisions rendezvoused in the southeast Coral Sea. Fletcher divided his forces and steamed north with a task group centered on Yorktown. On the 4th, Yorktown's planes attacked the Japanese convoy off Tulagi. The carrier launched 3 strikes with torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters, which sank few enemy ships. Nimitz later commented that the Tulagi operation was certainly disappointing in terms of ammunition expended to results obtained. The admiral stated that it emphasized the necessity for target practice at every opportunity. As would be common throughout the war, the pilots' eagerness often had the effect of inflating their meager success into a magnificent victory. After recovering his planes, Fletcher spent the remainder of the 4th and all the next day steaming to rejoin Lexington. The Japanese, after successfully taking Tulagi, failed to coordinate their movements. The Port Moresby groups, which steamed on May 4th, milled about the Louisiade, off the eastern tip of New Guinea, instead of pressing south. Admiral Takagi's striking force moved with greater purpose. Assuming that Fletcher would move west to intercept the Port Moresby forces, Takagi maneuvered west and south to cut him off from American bases to the east. The 7th was a day of confusion, with the Americans gaining the advantage. Once again, Fletcher divided his force, sending some of his cruisers under Rear Admiral Grace to intercept the Port Moresby invasion group as it departed from the Jomard Passage. Within the same hour, both Fletcher and Takagi received faulty aerial reconnaissance reports. The Japanese acted first. Enemy pilots launched and sped out to strike a carrier and a cruiser, only to discover the fleet oiler Neosho and destroyer Sims. The latter sank in minutes, but Neosho, although badly battered, survived for 4 days. While the Japanese expended their efforts on these targets, American planes hit the Port Moresby covering group. Initially, they had followed the wrong course based on an error in the morning aerial reconnaissance report. Discovering light carrier Shoho, the dive bombers and torpedo bombers from Lexington and Yorktown sent her to the bottom within half an hour. The covering group now withdrew. Earlier, the invasion group had turned north after detecting Grace's cruisers. In late afternoon, the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, both Pearl Harbor raid veterans, launched a strike force of 27 planes. Poor information and bad weather caused them to miss their targets. Attempting to return to their carriers, several Japanese planes tried to land on the American carriers. Wildcats downed 8 of these, with one later ditching as a result of damage. 18 planes landed on the Japanese carriers. The Japanese forces involved in the Port Moresby operation had lost the confidence to advance until they had assurance that Fletcher's task force was destroyed. The balance of forces now appeared deceptively even. Both sides had 2 carriers, with the Americans having a slight advantage in numbers of flyable aircraft. Despite superficial appearances, the Americans were in trouble. The Japanese had numerous advantages. United States planes were much slower than theirs. The Japanese possessed a better mix of dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters in their strike groups. Japanese torpedo squadrons had a longer range and faster weapon. The enemy had more combat experience as a unit than Fletcher's men, whose high morale could not bridge the Gulf. And weather conditions favored the enemy when the American ships headed south into clear skies, while the Japanese remained under the cover of clouds and showers during their advance. The decisive actions on the 8th had all occurred by early afternoon. At dawn, both forces launched scout planes. Discovery of the opposing carriers and launching of the strike groups took place within minutes of each other. Japanese planes received better target direction. Even worse, direction of the United States Combat Air Patrol failed miserably in its duty of protecting the carriers. The Japanese attacked, quickly scoring hits on both Lexington and Yorktown, which started fires. The former suffered more, but within an hour, damage control efforts apparently had succeeded. Meanwhile, the American attack groups had problems. Due to bad weather and faulty intelligence, only 2/3 reached the targets. For about an hour they attacked Shokaku, while Zuikaku remained sheltered under squalls. Perversely, that circumstance may have aided the pilots, who would have dissipated their attacks on 2 targets. At Coral Sea, they only had a 6% hit rate. The 28 dive bombers scored 3 hits, and the 22 torpedo planes failed to make any. After 12:40, the first battle between naval forces that never made visual contact ended. Following the strikes, both forces began to separate. Lexington, although sustaining 5 bomb and torpedo hits, continued in formation and received her incoming planes. Fires on the ship forced doctors to work in an atmosphere of poisonous gases. Captain Frederick Sherman wrote afterwards that he must comment on the heroism of the men. It was an inspiration. The first thought of all was for the wounded. At 12:47, a major internal explosion, caused by gas vapors released by a torpedo hit, ignited by a generator spark, rocked the ship. Still, planes continued to land until 14:14. At 14:45, a second major explosion wreaked havoc on the fire and engine room ventilation system. By 15:15, the fire was beyond control, and the danger of bombs exploding from overheating was possible. At 16:30, with the steam safety valves lifted, Lexington stopped dead in the water. Admiral Aubrey Fitch ordered Sherman to abandon ship at 17:07. The captain recalled that in the evacuation there was not the slightest panic and disorder. 2 hours later, a destroyer fired 4 torpedoes into Lexington, sending her to the bottom. Witnesses commented that her former crew burst into tears as she sank. An officer on board Yorktown said, "There she goes. She did not turn over. She is going down with her head up. Dear old Lexington, a lady to the last." Coral Sea resulted in a Japanese tactical victory, but the United States Navy was the real winner. The Japanese sank a fleet carrier and a destroyer and damaged another fleet carrier, losing only a light carrier and suffering damage to a fleet carrier. American forces withdrew from the area. With air groups too battered to support further advance, the Japanese were brought to a standstill. Port Moresby remained in Allied control. The operation to capture the Nauru and Ocean Islands, deterred by the May 15th spotting of Rear Admiral Halsey's two-carrier Task Force 16, was not resumed until 3 months later, too late to offer much boost to enemy spirits. Shokaku was so severely damaged that she could not join the Midway carrier force. Zuikaku, owing to losses of pilots and planes, required squadron reorganization that removed her too from that campaign. The damage to Yorktown proved to be quickly patched in time for Midway. American pilots, fighter directors, combat air patrols, and aerial reconnaissance and damage control crew realized that they needed more schooling in the art of carrier warfare. The Battle of Coral Sea stabilized the Southwest Pacific Front and reduced Japanese carriers available for Midway by a third. It proved a harbinger of things to come in both the carrier battles of the Pacific and the resurgence of the Navy. Japanese planners had cast interested glances at Midway, a place they regarded as the sentinel for Hawaii, since before hostilities began with the devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, 2 destroyers had shelled the atoll to cover Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's retirement westward. The idea of taking Midway, however, generated little urgency until April 18, 1942, when the Halsey Doolittle Raid, while causing scant material damage, prompted a fateful decision on the part of the enemy's high command. To prevent another such affront to the sacred homeland and draw out the elusive Pacific Fleet carriers that had operated with virtual impunity against the Japanese Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, no longer encountered any opposition to his plan to overpower the Sentinel. Animated by the confidence that had seen them through successive victories in the Pacific, not even the setback they had been dealt at Coral Sea, where they lost the services of 2 carriers, could dampen Japanese spirits. The Japanese, while confident in their own ability to carry out their plans, knew precious little about the American dispositions. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet, however, thanks to the ceaseless monitoring of the enemy's naval communications, knew the intent and scope of the Japanese plans. To deceive the Japanese as to where his carrier strength lay, Nimitz had dispatched Task Force 16, under Vice Admiral William Halsey, Jr., with Enterprise and Hornet, to the South Pacific in late April. Their very presence in that area led the Japanese into believing that every American carrier then in the Pacific was in the region of the Coral Sea. Over-optimistic Japanese reports of the damage they had inflicted on Task Force 17 at Coral Sea, that not only Lexington was sunk but Yorktown as well, she had only been damaged, prompted the enemy to think that no American carriers would oppose them at Midway. Nimitz's visit to Midway on May 2nd and 3rd, 1942, to see the atoll's defences for himself, left him satisfied that, with appropriate reinforcement, the atoll would stand a good chance of turning back a Japanese amphibious landing. Nimitz did his best to see that Midway got what it needed to defend itself. Men and materiel, transported by sea and air, strengthened the garrison. On May 27, 1942, corresponding to May 26 at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese carrier striking force sailed from Japanese home waters. A second force, comprising transports and their escorts, carried attack and occupation troops. Enemy submarines fanned out across the sea lanes between Hawaii and Midway to intercept any reinforcements coming by sea, but, deployed too late, they missed the passage of the 2 task forces that Nimitz deployed to defend Midway. Principally, the battle in the offing boiled down to one of carrier strength. To oppose the 4 Japanese carriers, Admiral Nimitz sent to the sea the only 3 he had, Enterprise and Hornet, in Task Force 16, Halsey having expedited their return, and Task Force 17 with Yorktown. Yorktown returned to the fray with patched bomb damage and a scratch air group, Fighter Squadron 3, actually a mix of pilots, Bombing Squadron 3 and Torpedo Squadron 3, and Bombing Squadron 5, which became, temporarily, Scouting Squadron 5. Only Scouting Squadron 5 and some of the pilots in Fighter Squadron 3, which included veterans of Coral Sea, had seen action. Enterprise carried a good percentage of veterans in her Fighter Squadron 6, Bombing Squadron 6, and Torpedo Squadron 6, while Scouting Squadron 6 had had a good percentage of new pilots due to the attrition from the early Pacific raids. Hornet's squadrons had yet to see combat. Command of the carrier task forces, since Vice Admiral Halsey was incapacitated by a painful case of shingles, devolved into the hands of Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, whom Nimitz called an excellent, sea-going, fighting naval officer, and who had done a fine job and exercised superior judgment at the helm of Task Force 17 at Coral Sea. On Halsey's recommendation, Nimitz replaced Halsey at the helm of Task Force 16 with Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, a gifted and competent flag officer who had commanded Task Force 16's cruisers from the outset of hostilities. Neither Fletcher nor Spruance was an aviator, but both wisely sought the advice and counsel of aviators on their respective staffs. Vowing to greet our expected visitors with the kind of reception they deserve, Nimitz gave Midway all the strengthening it could take. One transport brought out fighters and dive bombers, and pilots to fly them, to reinforce the existing squadrons respectively. By June 4, 1942, Navy patrol planes, Army bombers, and Navy torpedo bombers from a detachment crammed the atoll. The patrol planes and Army bombers drew search duties, the medium bombers, torpedo bombers, scout bombers, and dive bombers the attack tasks, while the fighters drew the duty of aerial defense. Nimitz promised Admiral Ernest King that the Pacific Fleet would do the best we can with what we have. The sparring between American and Japanese search planes began in the waning days of May. With each side seeking the other's whereabouts, encounters between search planes occurred, patrol planes dueling bombers from Wake Island. Although the patrol planes usually emerged damaged, the lumbering aircraft, although vulnerable, soon proved their worth. On June 3rd, a prowling patrol plane spotted 2 Japanese vessels on their way to join the occupation force. Army bombers launched from Midway ultimately located the inbound Japanese transport force, but their high-altitude bombing, while surprising the enemy, failed to score any hits. That night, a 4-patrol plane night torpedo attack, the first attempted during the war, holed 1 oiler. 1 aircraft strafed a transport. Nagumo had, at that point, 227 operational planes, 70, 3 fighter aircraft, 70, 2 dive bombers, 81 torpedo bombers, and 1 reconnaissance plane. Nagumo planned to launch a strike force of 108 planes, 36 fighters, 36 dive bombers, and 36 torpedo bombers, approximately half of those he had available to him. Nagumo's intelligence sources pinpointed only 30 fighters available to oppose them. At 4:28, 240 miles northwest of Midway, Nagumo's carriers commenced launch. By 4:40, the entire striking force had gotten aloft. It took departure at 4:45. Mechanical difficulties compelled only 1 plane to return. Nagumo retained a second strike group of 36 dive bombers, with 18 each on board 2 carriers, 36 torpedo bombers with 18 each in 2 other carriers, and 25 fighters distributed among the carriers. This was in case his search planes, put aloft from the heavy cruisers and battleship after his strike force had set out on its mission, so that presence of Japanese scouts would not tip Nagumo's hand, spotted an American task force. Delays on board the cruisers, however, prevented the timely deployment of the Admiral's airborne eyes. Nagumo detached a cruiser division to bombard Midway. As the Japanese bore down upon it, Naval Air Station Midway had stirred in the pre-dawn hours. Marine fighters had covered the launch of the patrol planes and Army bombers, and then landed, as the island stood down, planes with radios energized and engines warm. Soon thereafter, however, reports came in from the wide-ranging patrol planes. A patrol plane spotted something below through the low cumulus clouds and scattered showers and reported the main body of the Japanese fleet, thus putting Midway on the alert. All aircrew manned their planes and stood by with their engines turning over. Another patrol plane, 100 miles northwest by north of the atoll, subsequently spotted over 50 planes heading for the atoll and warned, in plain language, at 5:44, many planes heading Midway. Those reports ended the suspenseful wait. While the Marine anti-aircraft batteries received orders to fire upon all planes not identified as friendly, at 6 o'clock, the reports of the location of the Japanese carriers, provided by the patrol planes and reports of incoming aircraft, prompted Midway to clear the field of all operable aircraft. As the Japanese droned toward them, the Marine fighter squadron's 20 fighters and 4 additional fighters scrambled to intercept. Quickly following the fighters came the 6 torpedo bombers, the 4 Army torpedo-armed medium bombers, and the Marine Scout Bomber Squadron, 16 dive bombers and 12 scout bombers, each carrying a 500-pound bomb. The 2 groups of Marine Scout Bombers, minus one whose cowling blew loose, met at a designated point 20 miles from the island and set course to attack an enemy carrier 180 miles northwest of Midway. The Japanese, meanwhile, spotted the atoll about 6:15. 3 divisions of the Marine Fighter Squadron had been vectored out to intercept, while 2 others had been told to orbit 10 miles out, in case another group of enemy planes showed up on a different bearing. At the outset, the Marine Fighter Squadron enjoyed an advantage, torpedo bombers in the lead, with dive bombers behind and above them. The fighters trailed the entire formation. 2 divisions of fighters flamed 2 of the first group of 6 torpedo bombers and sent away 3 with heavy damage and trailing smoke. Another formation of torpedo bombers suffered 3 planes hit, one of which failed to reach its carrier. Unfortunately for the Marines, after their initial interception at about 14,000 feet and their first successful pass through the superbly disciplined enemy formations, the overwhelming number of enemy fighters quickly gained the upper hand, while the torpedo bombers and dive bombers bombed their objectives on Eastern and Sand Island targets. As a black plume of smoke corkscrewed skyward from burning fuel tanks, only a pitiful few Marine fighters returned to the Eastern Island strip. While Midway's defenders evaluated the damage and succored the wounded, Vice Admiral Nagumo, although confronted with conflicting reports about the damage his flyers had inflicted and not knowing whether or not American carriers lurked nearby, ordered at 7:15 his second attack wave to be re-equipped with bombs. Shortly before the Japanese admiral reached that decision, however, part of the strike group scrambled from Midway attacked his carriers. The 6 torpedo bombers led the way, followed by the 4 Army medium bombers that arrived almost simultaneously. Anti-aircraft fire and fighter opposition downed 5 of the 6 torpedo bombers and 2 of the medium bombers. Another difficulty now confronted Nagumo, and he postponed his planned second strike on Midway when a reconnaissance plane informed him of a formation of 10 surface ships with no details as to types, steaming 240 miles north by east of Midway. At 7:39, shortly after his carriers had begun recovery of the morning strike, Nagumo altered course and, at 7:45, ordered his carriers to prepare to carry out attacks on enemy fleet units, leave torpedoes on the planes which have not yet been changed to bombs. 2 minutes later, he directed the reconnaissance plane to ascertain types of ships and maintain contact. Soon after Nagumo made those dispositions of his force, Major Henderson and his group, flying at 9,500 feet, sighted the mobile force at 7:55. Enemy fighters shot down 6 of the Marine dive bombers. The remaining planes attacked 1 carrier but scored only 1 near miss and inflicted some damage from strafing. Radio gunners in the dive bombers splashed 1 enemy fighter. Soon after the last of the Marine dive bombers had cleared the area, Nagumo received the unexpected and disturbing news from the reconnaissance plane at 8:20 that a carrier appeared to be in the American force. Nagumo's ordering his planes rearmed for a strike on surface ships, however, delayed the launch of planes to deal with the threat. In the meantime, ships in the screen dealt with the presence of submarine Nautilus, which had crept into the midst of his disposition, while Nagumo's men proceeded to rearm a portion of a strike. Soon afterward, the rest of the Marine Scout Bomber Squadron attacked a battleship with no success. The Army heavy bombers, which finally located the Japanese at that juncture, loosed their bomb loads, but their targets, the carriers, easily evaded them. While neither the torpedo bombers, medium bombers, dive bombers, scout bombers, nor heavy bombers scored any damage, they had seriously disrupted Nagumo's routine. At 6 o'clock, as planes from Midway had been scrambling to get airborne in the path of the incoming strike, Fletcher had ordered Spruance to proceed to the northwest. At 6:03, as Task Force 16 was settling on its new course, Fletcher and Spruance received the unauthenticated report pinpointing 2 carriers, not the 4 that intelligence estimates had predicted, and battleships 175 miles to the southwest. His search planes still aloft, Fletcher ordered Spruance to proceed southwesterly and attack enemy carriers as soon as definitely located, and informed him, "I will follow as soon as planes recovered." He thus kept Task Force 17 in reserve, while Spruance and his staff decided upon a 7 o'clock launch when the enemy would, by their calculations, be 155 miles to the west-southwest of Task Force 16. Meanwhile, Yorktown's dawn search returned empty-handed. Flight operations completed, Fletcher turned Task Force 17 to follow Task Force 16, Yorktown's squadrons to be held in reserve. Enterprise and Hornet commenced getting planes aloft at 7 o'clock Salome. Hornet put up 10 fighters to escort 34 dive bombers, 15 from one squadron, 2 planes from the air group section, and 17 planes from another squadron. 15 torpedo bombers brought up the rear. From Enterprise rose the 3-plane air group section, 15 dive bombers from one squadron, and 15 dive bombers from another squadron. Mechanical casualties forced 4 dive bombers to be struck below. Delays, light wind conditions, and the necessity of spotting the torpedo squadron's 15 aircraft and the escorting fighters on deck prompted Spruance, at 7:45, to order his planes to proceed on mission assigned. Enterprise's air group commander plotted his course to intercept the Japanese to the southwest. The torpedo bombers were to join up en route. While Task Force 16 was getting its planes airborne, Task Force 17 steamed to the southwest at 25 knots. Frank Jack Fletcher, eager to find the other 2 Japanese carriers believed to be a part of the enemy striking force, waited until the report of a snooper near Task Force 17, shortly after 8 o'clock, changed the complexion of things. Fletcher decided at 8:38 to launch 17 dive bombers, 12 torpedo bombers, and 6 fighters to attack the same carriers against which Spruance had sent his planes. He would reserve 17 dive bombers for either a search or for a second attack. Although basing their estimate on the 2-hour-old contact report, Yorktown's strike planners plotted an interception. Yorktown, steaming to the southeastward, then drew away from Task Force 16 as she launched planes. Hornet's torpedo squadron located Nagumo first, unaware that their fighter escort had strayed, resulting in the fighters following the wrong torpedo squadron. Ultimately, all 10 of the fighter squadron's aircraft had to ditch. Undeterred, the torpedo squadron bravely bore in on Nagumo's carriers. Anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters, however, splashed all 15 torpedo bombers. Only one pilot survived, by hiding beneath his seat cushion in the midst of the Japanese fleet, to tell the tale of what transpired soon thereafter. Enterprise's torpedo squadron came next. Although it did not suffer the losses inflicted by flak and fighters on Hornet's ill-fated torpedo bombers, it likewise enjoyed no success. Both torpedo squadrons had, however, drawn down the Japanese combat air patrol. After the massacre of Task Force 16's torpedo planes, Nagumo's carriers steamed in disarray, the morning's emergency maneuverings having broken up their disposition. One carrier steamed off to the north, protected by a front, with the other 3 trailing. At about that juncture, the Enterprise Air Group appeared on the scene, having sniffed out the scent by following the speeding destroyer which Nagumo had detached to stay behind and deal with the troublesome submarine as she headed for the main body of the Japanese striking force. Almost simultaneously, but in wholly spontaneous fashion, Yorktown's strike group arrived. Both groups attacked as soon as circumstances permitted. The torpedo squadron from Yorktown brought up the rear of the torpedo attack, but despite the valiant efforts of the 6-plane escort, enemy fighters took their toll of the squadron's men and machines. In only a few minutes, the dive bombers from the 2 American carriers pummeled 3 of the once proud Japanese flatops into blazing and exploding junk. One bombing squadron, although diminished by some pilots having inadvertently dropped their bombs en route due to a switch malfunction, knocked one carrier out of the fight, while two other squadrons did the same to two other carriers. One carrier, however, off to the north, momentarily escaped destruction, to achieve some measure of vengeance. Search planes having pinpointed Task Force 17's location, a force of dive bombers escorted by fighters set upon Yorktown, scoring 3 bomb hits despite furious anti-aircraft fire and a dogged defense by fighter planes that were augmented by those from other squadrons. Stopped dead in the water, Yorktown lay helpless as her screen deployed around her and her returning strike group landed on board Enterprise and Hornet. Spruance detached 2 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers to lend a hand. Fletcher, realizing that he could no longer exercise tactical command, transferred his flag to a cruiser and turned over the reins to Spruance. That afternoon, a search, launched by Yorktown earlier that day, spotted the remaining carrier. A second strike, comprised of planes from Enterprise, which included ex-Yorktown planes among them, then mortally wounded the carrier, which was abandoned and sank the next morning. Yorktown's damage control people eventually got her underway in time to be hit by a second Japanese attack, this time by torpedo planes that had been launched before the Enterprise pilots had found her, that stopped the ship for the second time and forced her abandonment. The screening ships of Task Force 17 took on board the carrier's survivors and moved off, with Fletcher leaving 1 destroyer to guard the crippled flat top. Ultimately, a Japanese submarine torpedoed Yorktown a second time, on June 6th, while a salvage party, gathered on the 5th, laboured mightily to get her underway. The gallant lady sank on the morning of June 7th. The cruiser division detached by Nagumo to shell the atoll ran into difficulty. A fleet submarine happened across the division, and, in the resultant confusion, 2 cruisers collided. Search planes picked up their trail and subsequent strikes, launched from Midway and from Enterprise and Hornet, eventually sank 1 cruiser and badly damaged another. Airstrikes from Hornet and Enterprise missed damaging a destroyer, as did a heavy bomber strike. The heavy losses inflicted by the men from Yorktown, Enterprise and Hornet forced Admiral Yamamoto to abandon his plans for trying to take Midway on June 4th. The action on the 6th against the fleeing cruisers proved to be the last undertaken before Rear Admiral Spruance broke contact with the Japanese. Over subsequent days, patrol planes rendered important service in ranging over the Pacific, either aiding or effecting the rescue of survivors from both sides. Admiral Nimitz and his subordinate commanders, Rear Admirals Fletcher and Spruance, knew of the enemy's capabilities and intent. Merely knowing what the Japanese planned to do, however, was not enough. The Pacific Fleet's carrier striking force, formed around the only 3 flatops available at that time, had to prove equal to the task of denying the enemy's carrying out its plans. That task was accomplished with a high loss of men and planes, reminding at least one participant that war was a grim and terrible business, but they had achieved a victory. They had written what Admiral Nimitz proudly called a glorious page in our history. The development of patrol aviation in the Pacific in the 1920s and 1930s set the pattern for operations in the months after Pearl Harbor. Beginning with a little-remembered mass flight of San Diego-based flying boats to the Panama Canal Zone and return during the winter of 1920 through 21, Pacific patrol planes exercised in long-range deployments and advanced base operations supported by seaplane tenders. By 1934, with the advent of new aircraft, one squadron pioneered deployment of aircraft from the west coast to Hawaii. From that time, mass flights in succeeding years were conducted in support of annual fleet exercises. They involved extensive tender-based operations from various Pacific islands. One converted carrier supported the first mass patrol squadron deployment to Alaska in 1937. For their participation on the side of the Allies during World War I, Japan was awarded a mandate over former German possessions in the Pacific. This mandate included various island groups, with the exception of Guam, a United States possession. Beginning in 1932, the mandated area was closed to foreign access. Though forbidden by terms of the mandate, Japan was free to arm the area, undetected and unmolested. Various international treaties agreed upon during the 1920s and 1930s created a situation where wishful thinking replaced informed reason, and the economic depression served to focus American attention on domestic problems while lending support to the forces of isolationism. Responsible officials in government reacted to pass legislation increasing the size of our under-strength navy. Following congressional direction, in 1938, the Secretary of the Navy appointed a board under Rear Admiral Hepburn charged with determining which naval bases should be enlarged and which new ones should be constructed. The board report called for a chain of new naval air bases as far west as Guam. The list recommended bases at various locations in Alaska, Hawaii, and Pacific Islands, and an advanced fleet operating base at Guam. Congress dropped Guam and Wake Island from its original authorization. With the passage of the 1939 Appropriations Bill, the Navy Department contracted with a consortium of the nation's largest construction firms, named officially contractors, Pacific Naval Air Bases. The bases resulting from this program became the facilities from which patrol aviation expanded across the Pacific during World War II. Throughout the 1930s, the major vessels assigned to the Pacific were home-ported on the West Coast. Annual battle problems were conducted either in the vicinity of the Panama Canal or in the Hawaiian area, with return to home ports upon completion of the exercises. Pearl Harbor served as an advanced base for the units deployed to Hawaii. Japanese aggression in China resulted in a decision by President Franklin Roosevelt to keep the battleships in Pearl Harbor following completion of the 1940 battle problem instead of returning them to their West Coast home. Ports. Rear Admiral Bellinger, Commander, Patrol Wing 2, found his command with far greater requirements for aerial search and patrol than his limited assets would permit. Following notification that Patrol Wing 2 would be the last wing in the Navy to be equipped with modern aircraft, Rear Admiral Bellinger prepared a comprehensive report advising the Chief of Naval Operations of the low state of operational readiness of Patrol Wing and recommending required actions to correct the situation. This report became a blueprint for subsequent remedial actions, but additional support was slow in coming. In October 1941, Patrol Wing 1, with 3 squadrons, deployed to the unfinished base at Kaneohe Bay from San Diego. Combined with the 4 squadrons assigned to Patrol Wing 2, Bellinger had 7 patrol squadrons under his command. Several of these squadrons were equipped with the obsolescent early models of patrol aircraft. For many months before war began, the fleet commander had insisted upon a heavy schedule of daily patrols, each lasting about 18 hours. This heavy patrol schedule, combined with an equally heavy training load, resulted in maintenance workloads that could not be supported with available assets. Based upon an evaluation of available intelligence that if war came, it would come first in the Philippines and Southeast Asia, the new fleet commander, Admiral Kimmel, called off the heavy patrol schedule. On the eve of war, Pacific Patrol Aviation was deployed as follows. Patrol Wing 1, Kaneohe Bay, Hawaii, 3 squadrons. Patrol Wing 2, Ford Island, Hawaii, 4 squadrons with 1 deployed to Midway. Patrol Wing 4, Sandpoint, Washington, 2 squadrons with 1 deployed to Alaska, and Patrol Wing 10, Cavite, Philippines, 2 squadrons with 1 at Sangley Point and the other at Olongapo. Detachments were dispersed in the southern Philippines. Other Pacific Patrol squadrons not operating under wing control were located at Alameda and North Island, California, December 7, 1941. As dawn broke on Oahu, 3 planes were airborne on routine patrols. Shortly after 6:30, the crew of 1 aircraft, in coordination with a destroyer, attacked a midget submarine in the approaches to Pearl Harbor. Without realizing it, they had fired the first shots in the air war against the Japanese Empire. No further action was taken regarding this attack. With the exception of the 3 planes on patrol, 4 aircraft on training missions, and 1 squadron deployed to Midway, all Hawaiian-based patrol planes were parked closely, in neat lines, to facilitate defense against sabotage, considered by authorities to be the most probable threat. At Kaneohe, 4 patrol aircraft were at moorings in the bay. Before the morning was over, the vast majority of the aircraft of 6 squadrons was damaged or destroyed. None of the few search aircraft available were able to locate the Japanese carrier force. War came to Patrol Wing 10 about 4 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. A seaplane tender was attacked in Davao Gulf, and 2 of its patrol aircraft were sunk by strafing. The aircraft of the wing were well dispersed. Fuel and other material had been prepositioned in lakes, swamps, and coves, and other places where operations could be supported from areas offering some concealment. Patrol Wing 10's missions were to search for and attack the Japanese from advanced bases whenever possible, and to search and scout for the Asiatic fleet as it retired southward to the Netherlands East Indies, according to the war plan. Evacuation of key personnel from the Philippines and rescue were vital secondary missions. On December 10th, a Japanese force of 2 battleships, a light cruiser, and 2 destroyers was sighted, and 5 patrol aircraft from Los Banos attacked, causing damage to a battleship. By mid-December, Patrol Wing 10 was reduced to less than 1 squadron of operable aircraft. Captain Wagner, the wing commander aboard a tender, deployed south. The wing successively operated from Balikpapan, Borneo, Manado, Celebes, finally arriving at Surabaya, Java, on December 21st. From December 26 through mid-January, the wing was assigned long-range search missions, flying from Ambon in the Seram Islands. Dutch and Australian patrols also flew from Ambon, and cooperation, particularly with the Australians, was excellent. Numerous rescue operations were conducted as Allied forces retreated ahead of the advancing Japanese onslaught. On January 11, 1942, 6 patrol aircraft arrived at Ambon from Pearl Harbor via Darwin, Australia. In these early days of the war, there was no established pool of spare aircraft or advanced bases with supplies in the forward areas. Operations were ad hoc, and the resourcefulness of flight crew and maintenance personnel kept the operations going in spite of almost insurmountable odds. With the evacuation of Ambon in mid-January, the normal method of operation was 2 to 3 plane detachments with the tenders at various locations throughout the Netherlands East Indies and at Darwin. In late January, the combined Allied forces attacked a fleet of 31 Japanese ships in Makassar Strait, and for a short time turned the Japanese back. Patrols continued. Toward the end of February, the wing moved south to Darwin. On February 19th, the Japanese attacked, destroying all the planes there and badly damaging 1 tender. After the Battle of the Java Sea, the Netherlands East Indies became untenable, and on March 1st, the Allied command was dissolved, and patrol aviation removed to Australia. Patrol Wing 10 had amassed a courageous record against overwhelming odds. From the view of the war in the Pacific as a whole, these desperate early months operations and the carrier Battle of the Coral Sea blunted and stopped the Japanese drive to the south. This period has been termed the beginning of the end of tragedy. While the bitter actions involving Patrol Wing 10 were taking place, patrol aviation in other areas of the Pacific was rebuilding resources and gaining strength for the battles that lie ahead. Patrol Wing 8 was established at Norfolk, Virginia, in October 1941 and prior to December 7th, had been engaged in anti-submarine warfare and convoy protection operations as part of the Neutrality Patrol in the North Atlantic. Upon declaration of war, Patrol Wing 8 was transferred to Alameda, California. The wing was under the operational control of Commander, Western Sea Frontier, conducting anti-submarine warfare patrols, inshore patrols, convoy coverage, and air-sea rescue services as directed. Patrol Wing 8 supported the formation and training of new squadrons to operate various aircraft types. It also trained replacement aircrew and maintenance personnel for deployed squadrons and established new service units, which were subsequently deployed to forward areas. Naval Air Station Alameda was designated a terminal for trans-Pacific aircraft movements to and from Hawaii, and Patrol Wing 8 guarded and controlled these flights. During the war, 75 squadrons trained and operated under Patrol Wing 8 command. These included a blimp squadron and 4 Army Air Corps squadrons flying various aircraft, with the exception of the 3 planes on patrol, 4 aircraft on training missions, and 1 squadron deployed to Midway. All Hawaiian-based patrol planes were parked closely, in neat lines, to facilitate defense against sabotage, considered by authorities to be the most probable threat. At Kaneohe, 4 patrol aircraft were at moorings in the bay. Before the morning was over, the vast majority of the aircraft of 6 squadrons was damaged or destroyed. None of the few search aircraft available were able to locate the Japanese carrier force. War came to Patrol Wing 10 about 4 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. A seaplane tender was attacked in Davao Gulf, and 2 of its patrol aircraft were sunk by strafing. The aircraft of the wing were well dispersed. Fuel and other material had been prepositioned in lakes, swamps and coves, and other places where operations could be supported from areas offering some concealment. Patrol Wing 10's missions were to search for and attack the Japanese from advanced bases whenever possible, and to search and scout for the Asiatic fleet as it retired southward to the Netherlands East Indies, according to the war plan. Evacuation of key personnel from the Philippines and rescue were vital secondary missions. On December 10th, a Japanese force of 2 battleships, a light cruiser, and 2 destroyers was sighted, and 5 patrol aircraft from Los Banos attacked, causing damage to a battleship. By mid-December, Patrol Wing 10 was reduced to less than 1 squadron of operable aircraft. Captain Wagner, the wing commander aboard a tender, deployed south. The wing successively operated from Balikpapan, Borneo, Manado, Celebes, finally arriving at Surabaya, Java, on December 21st. From December 26 through mid-January, the wing was assigned long-range search missions, flying from Ambon in the Seram Islands. Dutch and Australian patrols also flew from Ambon, and cooperation, particularly with the Australians, was excellent. Numerous rescue operations were conducted as Allied forces retreated ahead of the advancing Japanese onslaught. On January 11, 1942, 6 patrol aircraft arrived at Ambon from Pearl Harbor via Darwin, Australia. In these early days of the war, there was no established pool of spare aircraft or advanced bases with supplies in the forward areas. Operations were ad hoc, and the resourcefulness of flight crew and maintenance personnel kept the operations going in spite of almost insurmountable odds. With the evacuation of Ambon in mid-January, the normal method of operation was 2 to 3 plane detachments with the tenders at various locations throughout the Netherlands, East Indies, and at Darwin. In late January, the combined Allied forces attacked a fleet of 31 Japanese ships in Makassar Strait, and for a short time turned the Japanese back. Patrols continued. Toward the end of February, the wing moved south to Darwin. On February 19th, the Japanese attacked, destroying all the planes there and badly damaging 1 tender. After the Battle of the Java Sea, the Netherlands East Indies became untenable, and on March 1st, the Allied command was dissolved and patrol aviation removed to Australia. Patrol Wing 10 had amassed a courageous record against overwhelming odds. From the view of the war in the Pacific as a whole, these desperate early months operations and the carrier Battle of the Coral Sea blunted and stopped the Japanese drive to the south. This period has been termed the beginning of the end of tragedy. While the bitter actions involving Patrol Wing 10 were taking place, patrol aviation in other areas of the Pacific was rebuilding resources and gaining strength for the battles that lie ahead. Patrol Wing 8 was established at Norfolk, Virginia, in October 1941, and prior to December 7th, had been engaged in anti-submarine warfare and convoy protection operations as part of the Neutrality Patrol in the North Atlantic. Upon declaration of war, Patrol Wing 8 was transferred to Alameda, California. The wing was under the operational control of Commander, Western Sea Frontier, conducting anti-submarine warfare patrols, inshore patrols, convoy coverage, and air-sea rescue services as directed. Patrol Wing 8 supported the formation and training of new squadrons to operate various aircraft types. It also trained replacement aircrew and maintenance personnel for deployed squadrons and established new service units, which were subsequently deployed to forward areas. Naval Air Station Alameda was designated a terminal for trans-Pacific aircraft movements to and from Hawaii, and Patrol Wing 8 guarded and controlled these flights. During the war, 75 squadrons trained and operated under Patrol Wing 8 command. These included a blimp squadron and 4 Army Air Corps squadrons flying various aircraft. A decision in 1920 had effectively precluded the Navy from developing land-based patrol aircraft. In order to provide patrol aircraft the ability to carry their own beaching gear, providing increased operational flexibility, the Bureau of Aeronautics contracted with Consolidated to develop an amphibious version. The first of these were assigned to the Pacific in December 1941. Throughout the early months of 1942, patrol aviation in the Pacific worked desperately to rebuild its strength. To provide better administrative support to these efforts, in April, Aircraft Scouting Force was redesignated Patrol Wings Pacific. In May, radio interception and our breaking of Japanese codes gave warning of a new threat in the Central Pacific, with a feint at the Aleutian Islands. In May also, a patrol wing deployed to Kodiak, Alaska, with 2 patrol squadrons, supported by several small seaplane tenders. The first thrust of the expected attack was a Japanese carrier strike on Dutch Harbor and Fort Glenn on Unalaska Island on June 3. The raid served also to divert attention from the Japanese occupation of Attu and Kiska Islands in the Aleutians. Meanwhile, extensive searches were being conducted in the Midway area, with excellent coverage except in the north-northwest, where extremely poor visibility prevailed. One squadron made the first contact of the battle on June 3. The force, which proved to be the Japanese invasion force, was shadowed by the patrol aircraft, and during the afternoon, Army heavy bombers bombed from high altitude without results. Early on the morning of June 4, patrol aircraft staged the first night torpedo attack by our patrol aircraft. 1 or 2 ships were reported possibly damaged. Following a Japanese attack on Midway Island, 4 Army medium bombers made torpedo attacks on the Japanese with undetermined results. The major carrier battle then commenced, which resulted in the loss of all 4 Japanese carriers against the loss of Yorktown. Extensive search operations by patrol planes after the Battle of Midway resulted in the recovery of numerous survivors. The major offensive thrust of the Japanese Navy was halted at Midway, and the threat to Hawaii and the West Coast was removed. From Midway, the road led to ultimate victory, but years of hard patrolling lie ahead. Just after Midway, it was discovered that the Japanese had occupied Attu and Kiska. Beginning on June 11th, an around-the-clock bombing campaign was carried out by 3 patrol squadrons, supported by a tender anchored at Nazan Bay, ATKA Island. The operation, termed the Kiska Blitz, ended only when the tender ran out of gasoline, bombs, and bullets. The patrol aircraft was not designed as a dive bomber, but at Kiska it was flown as one. On September 1st, 1942, Patrol Wings Pacific was disestablished and Commander, Air Force, United States Pacific Fleet came into being. It was this command which directed the establishment, equipage, training, and support of naval aviation throughout the Pacific. It also controlled distribution of all aviation personnel and all maintenance and repair of assigned aircraft and aviation ships. The following month, a patrol wing was established at North Island, San Diego, California. The functions and operations of this wing were similar to those of Patrol Wing 8 at Alameda, as were those of Fleet Air Wing 6 established at Seattle in November 1942. Through the end of the war, a total of 52 squadrons trained or operated under one wing and 32 squadrons under another. On November 1st, the designation of all patrol wings was changed to Fleet Air Wings, in recognition that many diverse types of squadrons and aircraft were then assigned to the wings under the task organization concept. The Japanese offensive in the South Pacific resulted in their occupation of numerous island groups spread across thousands of miles of ocean. If America was to take advantage of its successes at Coral Sea and Midway, it would be necessary to go over to the offensive as soon as possible. The 1st Marine Division Reinforced was deployed to New Zealand, and plans evolved to invade the Japanese-held Tulagi-Guadalcanal area in the British Solomon Islands. Tulagi was taken on August 9th. The landing on Guadalcanal was unopposed. The first aircraft to land on previously Japanese-occupied territory was an amphibious patrol aircraft, which landed at Guadalcanal on August 12th. By the 20th, the first fighters and dive bombers had arrived at the just-named Henderson Field. The Cactus Air Force was in business. Japanese response was not long in coming. For the next year, a series of vicious naval battles took place throughout the Solomons area as both sides attempted to resupply their ground and air forces and to prevent enemy resupply. The Sound, running from Bougainville to Guadalcanal, between the northern and southern Solomon Islands, quickly became known as the Slot. During the day, Allied air and naval forces were able to control the area, making resupply of Guadalcanal possible. By night it was another story. The Japanese at first ruled the nights. Heavily escorted convoys came down the Slot so regularly that they came to be called the Tokyo Express. There were heavy losses on both sides. In order to provide operational control of growing patrol activities in the South Pacific, Patrol Wing 1 deployed to Noumea, New Caledonia, in September 1942. Through mid-1944, it had its headquarters successively at Espiritu Santo, Guadalcanal, and Munda, New Georgia Island. patrol aircraft tactics were evolving. At first, daylight searches and attacks against targets of opportunity, then more aggressive tactics as the battles became more desperate. At this point, it is interesting to look at the situation of Patrol Wings 1 and 2 in the months after Pearl Harbor. The destruction of planes on December 7th made it impossible to maintain squadron integrity, and the period through the Guadalcanal campaign was characterized by extreme flexibility in the assignment and use of both aircraft and crew. There was a tendency to pool available aircraft and to employ them in detachments rather than by squadrons. Since all Pacific Patrol squadrons flew the same aircraft type during this period, the use of detachments, each supported by a small seaplane tender, permitted great flexibility of operations and increased security since few planes were exposed to attack at any one location. The tenders shifted location frequently to decrease detection. The experience of one squadron during the first year of the war is an extreme example of this situation. In early December, the squadron was assigned to Patrol Wing 8 at Alameda, but deployed to Patrol Wing 2 in mid-December 1941. It was based at Ford Island for training and operations, maintaining detachments at Midway through early June 1942. During the Battle of Midway, one crew participated in the night torpedo mission against the Japanese invasion force on June 3rd through 4th. Also, during June through August 1942, a 6-plane detachment was stationed in the Aleutian Islands under Patrol Wing 4. This detachment participated in the bombing operation known as the Kiska Blitz from June 11th through 14th. August 1942 found one crew in charge of a 1-plane detachment assigned to Patrol Wing 1 in the South Pacific. In October, he torpedoed a Japanese cruiser in a daring night attack. Meanwhile, the rest of the squadron was transitioning from patrol aircraft to the then-new heavy bomber. In January 1943, the squadron deployed to the South Pacific, the first heavy bomber squadron to forward deploy in the Pacific. In March 1943, it lost its original designation when it was redesignated with a new number. From that date until October 1944, land-based patrol plane squadrons were designated bombing squadrons with 3-digit squadron numbers. Other squadrons assigned to Pacific Fleet Air Wings included long-range photo reconnaissance, rescue, and medical evacuation squadrons. The transformation of naval aviation operations in the Pacific during the early months of World War II demonstrated both the adaptability of American forces and the revolutionary nature of carrier-based warfare. What began as a desperate attempt to strike back at Japanese forces with limited resources evolved into a comprehensive offensive strategy that would ultimately determine the outcome of the Pacific War. The early carrier raids, though individually modest in their immediate tactical results, served crucial strategic purposes. They forced the Japanese to maintain defensive positions throughout their newly acquired empire, preventing them from concentrating their forces for decisive operations. More importantly, these raids provided invaluable combat experience for American pilots and crews who would later participate in the major carrier battles that defined the Pacific Campaign. The evolution of patrol aviation paralleled the development of carrier operations, with flying boat squadrons adapting from peacetime training exercises to wartime operational requirements under the most challenging circumstances. The flexibility demonstrated by patrol wings in deploying small detachments to forward bases, often supported by nothing more than a single tender and minimal supplies, exemplified the resourcefulness that characterized American naval aviation throughout the conflict. The breaking of Japanese naval codes provided the intelligence foundation that made possible the strategic victories at Coral Sea and Midway. Without this intelligence advantage, the numerical inferiority of American forces in the early war period would likely have resulted in continued Japanese expansion throughout the Pacific. The ability to anticipate enemy movements and concentrate limited forces at decisive points compensated for material disadvantages. The Battle of the Coral Sea, while tactically inconclusive, achieved the strategic objective of halting Japanese expansion toward Australia and establishing the principle that carrier aviation could successfully challenge enemy naval forces. The loss of Lexington was painful, but the damage inflicted on Japanese carrier forces, particularly the loss of experienced pilots and aircraft, proved more significant in the long term. Midway represented the culmination of this early period, where intelligence, tactical innovation, and individual courage combined to achieve a decisive victory against numerically superior forces. The destruction of 4 Japanese fleet carriers and their experienced air groups eliminated Japan's offensive capability in the Central Pacific and marked the beginning of American strategic initiative in the theater. The development of advanced base operations, pioneered during the desperate early months when every airfield and anchorage had to be defended or abandoned based on immediate tactical considerations, established the foundation for the island-hopping campaign that would follow. The lessons learned in maintaining aircraft and supporting operations from improvised facilities under combat conditions proved invaluable as American forces began their westward advance. The role of individual heroism, exemplified by figures such as Butch O'Hare and the crews who pressed home attacks against overwhelming odds, provided inspiration and demonstrated the fighting spirit that would sustain American forces through the long Pacific campaign. These early actions established traditions of courage and determination that became hallmarks of naval aviation throughout the war. The technological evolution evident in these early operations, from the initial reliance on pre-war aircraft designs to the rapid introduction of improved fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft, reflected the industrial capacity that would ultimately prove decisive. The ability to not only replace losses but to improve upon existing designs while maintaining operational tempo demonstrated advantages that Japan could not match. The coordination between different service branches, though sometimes imperfect in execution, showed the potential for joint operations that would become increasingly sophisticated as the war progressed. The Doolittle Raid exemplified this cooperation, combining Army Air Force personnel and equipment with Navy carriers and support vessels to achieve objectives beyond the capability of either service alone. The strategic implications of these early operations extended far beyond their immediate tactical results. By maintaining pressure on Japanese forces and preventing them from consolidating their conquests, American carrier and patrol aviation disrupted enemy timetables and forced premature commitment of resources to defensive operations. This disruption of Japanese strategic planning proved as valuable as any tactical victory. The emergence of new tactical doctrines, particularly in carrier operations and coordination between different types of aircraft, established patterns that would guide Pacific naval aviation for the remainder of the war. The hard-won lessons about fighter escort, damage control, and coordination between strike groups prevented the repetition of early mistakes and improved the effectiveness of subsequent operations. The human cost of these early operations, while significant, provided the experience base necessary for training the expanded naval aviation forces that would follow. Veterans of these early actions became the instructors and leaders who would guide the massive expansion of American naval aviation through 1943 and 1944. The logistical innovations developed during this period, from the use of seaplane tenders to support patrol operations, to the improvised maintenance facilities that kept aircraft operational under primitive conditions, established procedures that would be refined and expanded as American forces advanced across the Pacific. The ability to maintain complex aircraft under adverse conditions became a crucial advantage. The intelligence-gathering capabilities developed during these early operations, combining radio intercepts with visual reconnaissance and combat reports, created an information network that provided commanders with unprecedented awareness of enemy activities. This intelligence advantage, combined with improved communications, allowed for coordination of operations across vast distances. The psychological impact of these early operations, both on American and Japanese forces, established momentum that influenced subsequent operations. For American forces, these actions demonstrated that Japanese forces could be defeated and that offensive operations were possible despite material disadvantages. For Japanese forces, the constant threat of American raids disrupted planning and forced defensive measures that reduced offensive capability. The development of rescue operations, pioneered during this period by patrol aviation units, established procedures that would save thousands of lives throughout the Pacific campaign. The systematic search for and recovery of downed aircrew demonstrated the commitment to personnel that became a distinguishing characteristic of American naval aviation. The evolution of command structures, from the initial improvised arrangements to the more formal task force organizations that emerged by mid-1942, reflected the growing sophistication of American naval operations. The ability to coordinate multiple carrier groups and integrate patrol aviation with surface forces provided capabilities that exceeded the sum of individual components. The technological intelligence gathered during combat operations, from examination of captured equipment to analysis of enemy tactics and capabilities, informed the development of countermeasures and improved American equipment. This continuous cycle of improvement based on operational experience provided cumulative advantages that became increasingly significant as the war progressed. The establishment of forward bases and the development of mobile support capabilities created the infrastructure necessary for sustained operations at increasing distances from home ports. The ability to maintain and repair aircraft at forward locations reduced the need for lengthy returns to major bases and increased the tempo of operations. The integration of different aircraft types into coordinated strike packages, developed through trial and error during these early operations, established tactical procedures that maximized the effectiveness of available resources. The proper coordination of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes became a crucial factor in the success of subsequent operations. The emergence of specialized roles within naval aviation, from night operations to photo reconnaissance, reflected the growing complexity of Pacific operations and the need for capabilities beyond basic strike missions. These specialized capabilities would prove essential as operations expanded in scope and complexity. The development of weather reconnaissance and forecasting capabilities, essential for carrier operations in the vast Pacific, began during this early period and would become increasingly sophisticated as the war progressed. The ability to predict and operate in adverse weather conditions provided tactical advantages and reduced operational risks. The lessons learned about damage control and aircraft recovery, particularly evident in the experiences of Lexington and Yorktown, led to improvements in carrier design and procedures that increased the survivability of subsequent vessels. The ability to continue operations despite battle damage became a crucial factor in carrier operations. The evolution of pilot training programs, informed by combat experience and the need for rapid expansion of aircrew numbers, established systems that would produce the skilled personnel necessary for victory. The balance between thorough training and urgent operational requirements was continuously refined throughout this period. The development of maintenance procedures and supply systems capable of supporting operations at extended distances from industrial centers demonstrated the logistical capabilities that would prove essential as American forces advanced across the Pacific. The ability to maintain complex equipment under primitive conditions became a decisive advantage. The establishment of communication networks linking widely dispersed forces enabled coordination of operations across the vast Pacific theater. The development of secure communications and effective command and control systems provided capabilities that enemy forces could not match. These early months of Pacific naval aviation operations, though characterized by desperate circumstances and limited resources, established the foundation for the decisive victories that would follow. The combination of tactical innovation, strategic intelligence, individual heroism, and industrial capacity created advantages that would ultimately prove insurmountable. The lessons learned and the precedents established during this crucial period shaped the conduct of Pacific naval aviation for the remainder of the war and demonstrated the decisive potential of carrier-based air power in modern naval warfare.